The House Judiciary Committee hearing room fell silent as former Attorney General Bill Barr finished his forceful defense of presidential actions that many had questioned. His testimony had been commanding, his deep voice resonating with the confidence of someone who had occupied the highest legal office in the land. The president's actions were entirely within his constitutional authority, Barr declared, looking directly at the Democratic members who had spent hours challenging his interpretation of executive power. There was no abuse of power, no obstruction of justice, and certainly no criminal conduct warranting congressional action. The committee chairman nodded toward Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett, indicating her questioning time had begun. The freshman representative from Texas, a former civil rights attorney, calmly organized several documents before looking up at Barr. Instead of the emotional response he clearly anticipated, Crockett simply stated, "Mr. Barr, I'm holding the Department of Justice's own legal analysis from 2017 written under your supervision that directly contradicts what you just told this committee." She held up a document bearing official Justice Department letterhead. On page 37, your department concluded that the exact actions you're now defending would constitute, and I quote, "a textbook example of obstruction requiring immediate congressional oversight. Would you care to explain this contradiction?" The room erupted in gasps and murmurs as committee members from both parties reached for copies of the document. Barr's composed expression momentarily faltered as he recognized the memo that he himself had approved but clearly never expected to surface in this context. This wasn't just another congressional exchange, it was the moment when meticulous preparation transformed political theater into accountability. If you're watching this video, hit the like button and subscribe now to see more moments when evidence cuts through political spin. To fully appreciate the significance of this confrontation, it's essential to understand the backgrounds and motivations of these two formidable legal minds who approached this hearing from vastly different perspectives. William Barr had built his reputation over decades as one of the nation's most influential legal conservatives. His first tenure as Attorney General, under President George H.W. Bush, had established him as a staunch defender of executive authority. After a successful corporate career, his return to the Justice Department had been marked by controversial decisions that critics viewed as placing loyalty to the president above traditional departmental independence. At 72, Barr brought to the hearing the gravitas of his extensive government service and the confidence of someone accustomed to navigating Washington's most challenging political environments. Barr had prepared extensively for this congressional appearance, anticipating hostile questioning from Democrats about his handling of various investigations and his expansive view of presidential power. His strategy, evident from the opening moments, was to project absolute certainty in his legal interpretations, while dismissing contradictory views as politically motivated or legally uninformed. With his round glasses, gray hair, and imposing physical presence, Barr embodied the establishment authority that had long shaped Justice Department policy. For this hearing, Barr had arrived with a team of current and former Justice Department officials positioned strategically behind him. His opening statement had framed all controversial decisions as straightforward applications of established legal principles rather than political calculations. Republican committee members had reinforced this framing with friendly questions that allowed Barr to elaborate on the legal foundations for his most criticized actions. Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett brought a completely different background and perspective to this confrontation. At 42, the freshman representative had entered Congress after a distinguished career as a civil rights attorney who had successfully challenged systemic abuses of power in her native Texas. Her legal experience included winning complex cases against entrenched institutions by meticulously documenting patterns of misconduct that others had missed or ignored. Unlike many junior representatives who often used hearing time for general statements, Crockett had approached this opportunity with the precision of a skilled trial lawyer. In the weeks before Barr's appearance, she and her small staff had conducted exhaustive research not just on Barr's public statements, but on internal Justice Department documents and legal opinions issued during his tenure. This preparation extended beyond the obvious partisan points to identify specific contradictions between Barr's current positions and the department's own established legal standards. The hearing room itself added gravitas to the confrontation. The wood-paneled Judiciary Committee chamber, with its elevated dais and formal arrangement, created a quasi-judicial environment where legal arguments carried particular weight. Every seat in the public gallery was filled, with journalists from major networks positioned to capture what many expected would be another predictable partisan clash. The stakes were considerable. This wasn't merely a retrospective examination of past actions, but had direct implications for ongoing investigations and fundamental questions about presidential accountability. Barr's testimony was designed to establish a legal framework that would place certain executive actions beyond congressional or judicial review, a position with profound constitutional implications beyond any particular presidency. What made this confrontation especially noteworthy was that both participants approached it as legal professionals rather than merely partisan figures. While political motivations clearly influenced their perspectives, both Barr and Crockett fundamentally believed in their legal interpretations. This wasn't just political theater, it was a substantive clash between competing visions of constitutional authority and accountability, embodied in two skilled attorneys with the expertise to articulate complex legal principles in accessible terms. The stage was set for a confrontation that would move beyond the usual partisan talking points to address fundamental questions about executive power and congressional oversight questions that would resonate far beyond this particular hearing. The House Judiciary Committee hearing was already in its fourth hour when Chairman Johnson announced the chair recognizes the gentlewoman from Texas, Miss Crockett, for 5 minutes of questioning. The committee room had settled into the predictable rhythm of partisan questioning, Republicans praising Barr's judgment and legal acumen, Democrats challenging his interpretations and motivations. The former Attorney General had maintained his composure throughout, his deep voice and measured delivery projecting the authority that had defined his public persona. Congresswoman Crockett adjusted her microphone and began with none of the rhetorical flourishes that had characterized earlier Democratic questioning. "Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Barr, I'd like to focus specifically on the legal standards your Justice Department applied to questions of executive authority and congressional oversight." This straightforward opening caused Barr to nod slightly, perhaps anticipating another general discussion of constitutional principles where his decades of experience would give him the advantage. "During your testimony today, you've repeatedly stated that presidential communications with White House counsel are protected by executive privilege and cannot form the basis for obstruction charges or congressional oversight. Is that an accurate summary of your position?" Crockett asked. "That's essentially correct," Barr replied confidently. "The president's ability to receive candid legal advice from White House counsel is fundamental to executive function. Congress cannot criminalize or even scrutinize such communications without undermining the separation of powers established in our Constitution." Crockett nodded. "And you've also testified that directing subordinates to alter or create government records for legitimate policy purposes falls within the president's Article 2 authority and is similarly beyond congressional review. Is that correct?" "Yes," Barr confirmed, his voice reflecting the certainty of his conviction. "When the president directs executive branch activities related to policy implementation, those actions are presumptively legitimate exercises of constitutional authority. Congress oversteps when it attempts to criminalize or even investigate such core executive functions." "Thank you for that clarification," Crockett continued, maintaining a conversational tone that contrasted with the confrontational approach of earlier questioners. "Now, I'd like to discuss a Justice Department legal analysis developed during your tenure that addresses these precise questions." She retrieved a document from her folder, its official letterhead visible to the cameras. "This is a 2017 Office of Legal Counsel memorandum titled Constitutional Limitations on Congressional Oversight of Executive Communication Patterns. Are you familiar with this document, Mr. Barr?" A subtle shift in Barr's expression suggested momentary uncertainty. "The Office of Legal Counsel produces numerous memoranda. I can't claim specific recollection of every document without reviewing it." "Of course," Crockett acknowledged. "For the record, this memorandum was finalized on the 8th of June 2017 and bears your signature on the approval line. Committee staff has distributed copies to all members." As representatives began examining the document, Crockett continued, "The memorandum analyzes when congressional oversight can legitimately examine presidential communications with White House counsel and directives to alter federal records. On page 24, it states that executive privilege cannot shield communications made with the purpose of concealing violations of federal law or preventing legitimate congressional oversight of executive branch operations." She looked directly at Barr. "This legal standard from your own Justice Department directly contradicts what you've testified to today. How do you reconcile these positions?" Barr shifted slightly, recognizing the document but clearly surprised by its emergence in this context. "Congresswoman, legal analyses must be understood within their specific factual contexts. General principles stated in memoranda are always subject to case-by-case application. I appreciate the importance of context. Crockett responded. Let me provide exactly that context. On page 37, the memorandum specifically addresses presidential directives to alter federal records, stating that such actions, when undertaken to prevent Congress from accessing information about executive activities, constitute, and I quote, a textbook example of obstruction requiring immediate congressional oversight. Murmurs spread through the committee room as members on both sides recognized the significance of the contradiction. Barr's expression tightened slightly as he formulated his response. That language refers to a hypothetical scenario substantially different from the matters we're discussing today, he countered, his tone remaining measured, but with a new edge of defensiveness. The legal principles remain consistent when properly applied to specific circumstances. Crockett was prepared for this response. She removed another document from her folder. Mr. Barr, I'm now referring to a second document, a confidential Justice Department assessment dated the 15th of March 2018, analyzing the specific presidential actions you're defending today. This assessment, written by career prosecutors and approved by your office, concluded that these actions raise serious concerns under the legal standards established in our 2017 memorandum and would warrant congressional investigation under established departmental interpretations of executive privilege limitations. She placed both documents side by side on the display screen. This isn't about hypotheticals or different factual contexts, Mr. Barr. This is your department applying its own legal standards to the precise actions you're now claiming are beyond congressional scrutiny. The committee room fell completely silent as the implications registered. This wasn't a partisan disagreement about constitutional interpretation, it was a documented contradiction between Barr's testimony and the Justice Department's own legal analysis conducted under his supervision. Barr's response came after a pause that communicated more than his words. Preliminary assessments by staff attorneys don't represent final departmental positions. As Attorney General, I made the ultimate determination about the correct legal standards after considering all relevant factors. I understand your role as the final decision-maker, Crockett acknowledged. However, this creates a troubling scenario where the Justice Department established clear legal standards that would have required congressional oversight of these actions, but then abandoned those standards when applied to a specific case. Wouldn't this pattern suggest that political considerations, rather than consistent legal principles, determine the department's positions? This framing, focused on consistency of legal standards rather than partisan accusations, shifted the conversation from political theater to substantive legal analysis. Committee members on both sides recognized that Crockett had identified a legitimate contradiction that transcended typical partisan talking points. Barr attempted to regain control of the narrative. The Justice Department's positions evolved based on further legal analysis, not political considerations. Legal interpretations naturally develop as complex questions are examined more thoroughly. Evolution of legal positions is certainly legitimate, Crockett agreed, maintaining her measured tone. However, the department never issued any formal revision of its 2017 standards. In fact, I have here a third document guidance provided to U.S. attorneys in December 2019 that cites the same 2017 memorandum as controlling authority for evaluating executive privilege claims. She displayed this third document on the screen. Mr. Barr, the Justice Department continued to apply these legal standards in other cases, while abandoning them only in the specific case we're discussing today. How is that consistent with equal application of the law? The confrontation had reached its critical point. Rather than engaging in partisan accusations or general constitutional debates, Crockett had methodically established a documented pattern of inconsistency that could not easily be dismissed as political disagreement. The former Attorney General found himself having to explain not differences in legal philosophy but contradictions in the application of the department's own established standards. The committee room remained silent as Barr considered his response. The dynamic had shifted perceptibly. What began as another partisan exchange had transformed into a substantive examination of legal consistency that transcended political positioning. Congresswoman, Barr began, his tone more deliberate than before. Departmental memoranda provide general guidance rather than rigid rules. Context-specific factors may justify different applications of broad principles in particular cases. I appreciate that legal principles require contextual application, Crockett responded. However, the 2017 memorandum specifically addressed the contextual factors you're now citing and reached the opposite conclusion from what you've testified to today. This isn't about different contexts, it's about applying different standards to identical factual scenarios. She displayed a fourth document on the screen. This is an internal Justice Department email dated July 2018, responding to concerns raised by career attorneys about inconsistent application of legal standards. The email, sent by your principal deputy, acknowledges that the department was applying a modified standard in this specific case, and instructs staff not to reference the 2017 memorandum in their analyses. This revelation drew audible reactions from committee members. The email directly contradicted Barr's claim that evolving legal analysis rather than exceptional treatment explained the departmental position. Modified standards applied to individual cases undermine the rule of law, Mr. Barr. Crockett continued, would you agree that consistency in legal interpretation is fundamental to the Justice Department's mission? Of course, consistency matters, Barr conceded. But legal analysis isn't mathematical. Reasonable minds can reach different conclusions when applying general principles to complex scenarios. Reasonable disagreement is indeed part of legal analysis, Crockett acknowledged. But this wasn't a case of different legal minds reaching different conclusions. The same institution, the Justice Department, under your leadership, established clear standards and then deliberately set them aside in a specific case while continuing to apply them in others. She turned to address the full committee. Colleagues, this isn't about partisan disagreement over constitutional interpretation. It's about whether the Justice Department applies consistent legal standards regardless of who is being investigated. The documents before us demonstrate that established standards were explicitly modified for one specific case while continuing to apply to others. This framing, focused on institutional integrity rather than partisan advantage, resonated with members across the political spectrum. Several Republican representatives were examining the documents with visible concern, recognizing that the issue transcended immediate political alignments to address fundamental questions of equal application of law. Barr, recognizing the shifting dynamic, attempted to reframe the discussion. Congresswoman, you're presenting complex legal analyses without the full context of departmental deliberations. Executive branch legal positions necessarily evolve as new factors emerge and cases present novel questions. Crockett was prepared for this attempt to create ambiguity. Mr. Barr, to clarify any confusion about context, I'd like to display one final document. This is a Justice Department training presentation from October 2019, created under your supervision, that uses the exact scenario we're discussing today as a case study. She highlighted a specific slide on the screen. The presentation explicitly states that presidential directives to alter federal records to prevent congressional oversight would constitute obstruction under departmental standards and would not be protected by executive privilege. This training, presented while you were Attorney General, directly contradicts your testimony today. The impact was immediate and visible. This wasn't merely about differing interpretations or evolving standards, it was about the Justice Department teaching one legal standard internally while its leader publicly advocated the opposite position. The contradiction couldn't be explained away through references to context or reasonable disagreement. The committee chairman, recognizing the significance of the moment, granted Crockett additional time, a rare procedural acknowledgement that transcended partisan divisions. The gentlewoman may continue her questioning. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Crockett responded. Mr. Barr, given these documented contradictions, I'm left with a straightforward question. Was the Justice Department wrong in its 2017 memorandum, its internal assessments, and its training materials, or are you incorrect in your testimony today? This framing, presenting the contradiction as a straightforward factual matter rather than a partisan accusation, placed Barr in an unprecedented position. The former Attorney General, accustomed to controlling legal narratives through authoritative interpretation, found himself confronting documented contradictions from his own department. The legal positions I've articulated today represent my considered judgment on these constitutional questions, Barr replied, his voice steady but lacking the absolute certainty that had characterized his earlier testimony. Departmental documents represent steps in an evolving analysis that ultimately led to the positions I've described. With respect, Mr. Barr, Crockett responded, the documents show no evolution toward your current position. In fact, they show the department maintaining one set of standards for general application while creating exceptions for the specific case we're examining today. She addressed the committee again. Colleagues, When the Justice Department establishes legal standards but then abandons them in specific cases without formal revision or explanation, the rule of law itself is compromised. This isn't about which legal interpretation is preferable, it's about whether legal standards apply equally, regardless of who is being investigated. As her questioning time concluded, the atmosphere in the committee room had transformed completely. What began as an opportunity for Barr to defend controversial decisions through appeals to executive authority had become a substantive examination of inconsistent legal standards that transcended partisan positioning. Even Republican members now directed their questions toward understanding the apparent contradictions rather than simply providing opportunities for favorable testimony. One senior Republican asked, "Mr. Barr, could you help us understand why the department continued teaching these standards in its training materials if they no longer represented the official position?" This shift from partisan defense to substantive inquiry represented a remarkable transformation in the hearing's dynamic. Crockett's methodical presentation of documentary evidence had moved the conversation beyond political talking points to address fundamental questions about consistent application of law. As the hearing continued, subsequent questioners from both parties referenced the documents Crockett had introduced, asking increasingly specific questions about the apparent contradictions. The narrative had shifted irrevocably from abstract constitutional debates to concrete questions about institutional consistency and equal application of legal standards. In this sense, Crockett's questioning had achieved something rare in contemporary congressional hearings. It had created space for substantive oversight that transcended immediate partisan advantages to address fundamental questions about how legal standards should be applied in a constitutional democracy. The impact of Crockett's methodical dismantling of Barr's testimony extended far beyond the hearing room. As committee members filed out after adjournment, journalists who had anticipated standard partisan exchanges found themselves focusing on the substantive legal contradictions exposed during the hearing. "Congresswoman, how did you discover these internal Justice Department documents?" asked one reporter as Crockett briefly addressed the press outside the committee room. "These weren't secret documents, they were available through proper oversight channels," she explained. "The issue wasn't access to information but taking the time to conduct thorough research beyond the obvious partisan talking points. Effective oversight requires doing the homework to identify specific inconsistencies rather than relying on general accusations." This emphasis on substantive preparation rather than political positioning characterized her limited public comments about the exchange. Rather than claiming personal victory or attacking Barr's integrity, Crockett consistently focused on the institutional questions raised by inconsistent application of legal standards. Media coverage reflected this substantive focus. Justice Department applied different legal standards to presidential actions, documents show, read one headline, while another observed. Barr confronted with contradictory DOJ standards on executive privilege. Even outlets typically aligned with the former Attorney General's positions acknowledged the significance of the documented contradictions. For legal scholars and oversight experts, the exchange represented something significant beyond its immediate political context. What made Congresswoman Crockett's questioning so effective was her focus on institutional consistency rather than partisan advantage, noted a former Justice Department Inspector General. By documenting contradictions between established departmental standards and their application in specific cases, she raised questions that transcend political alignments to address fundamental principles of equal application of law. Law schools incorporated video of the exchange into curricula on congressional oversight and executive to the one authority, noting how Crockett's methodical approach transformed what could have been another partisan confrontation into a substantive examination of legal principles. A Harvard law professor observed in a widely shared analysis, rather than contesting Barr's constitutional interpretation directly, a debate that would inevitably reflect partisan divisions, she documented specific contradictions in the intentional application of the department's own established standards. This approach shifted the conversation from competing political narratives to factual inconsistencies that couldn't be easily dismissed. For Justice Department career attorneys, the public exposure of these contradictions proved particularly significant. In the months following the hearing, internal guidance emphasized the importance of consistent application of legal standards regardless of the parties involved. A revised departmental policy explicitly stated that legal standards regarding executive privilege and congressional oversight must be applied consistently across all cases without modification based on the subjects of investigation. This institutional response, focusing on systemic consistency rather than individual accountability, reflected the most consequential impact of Crockett's questioning. Rather than merely embarrassing a political opponent, she had identified a pattern of inconsistency that required institutional correction, regardless of which party controlled the department. Congressional oversight committees in both chambers adjusted their approach based on the effectiveness of Crockett's methodology. Staff counsel began focusing more intensively on identifying specific contradictions between witnesses' testimony and their prior statements or actions, rather than relying on general challenges to credibility or motivations. This shift from partisan accusation to documented inconsistency improved the substantive quality of oversight hearings across multiple committees. For Barr himself, the exchange represented a rare public challenge that couldn't be dismissed through appeals to authority or partisan framing. In subsequent appearances, he noticeably modified his absolutist claims about executive authority, acknowledging that context-specific factors might justify congressional oversight of presidential communications in certain circumstances. This subtle but significant shift reflected the effectiveness of Crockett's evidence-based challenge to previously unchallenged legal assertions. Perhaps most significantly, the exchange influenced how executive privilege claims were evaluated in subsequent congressional investigations. Rather than accepting or rejecting such claims based on partisan alignment, committees increasingly examined whether consistent legal standards were being applied across different cases. This institutional focus, prioritizing consistency over particular outcomes, strengthened congressional oversight regardless of which party controlled committees or the White House. 3 years later, when a different administration faced congressional investigations, a senior Republican senator explicitly referenced the Barr-Crockett exchange when evaluating executive privilege claims. "We need to ensure that consistent legal standards are applied regardless of which party occupies the White House," he noted during a committee hearing. "Precedents established in prior oversight matters should inform our approach today." This emphasis on consistency, applying the same legal standards regardless of partisan advantage, represented the most lasting legacy of the Small-Waiter confrontation. In a political environment often characterized by situational ethics and shifting standards, Crockett had demonstrated that effective oversight requires holding institutions to their own established principles rather than merely advancing partisan narratives. In her subsequent reflections on the exchange, Crockett emphasized this institutional perspective. "Congressional oversight isn't about scoring political points," she explained in a speech to law students. "It's about ensuring that our institutions apply consistent standards regardless of who holds power. When we focus on documented inconsistencies rather than partisan accusations, we strengthen the rule of law itself." This framing, prioritizing institutional integrity over immediate political advantage, captured the broader significance of the confrontation beyond its specific context. In an era often characterized by partisan performance rather than substantive oversight, Crockett had demonstrated an approach that could strengthen constitutional governance regardless of which party controlled various branches of government. The Barr-Crockett exchange thus entered the institutional memory of Congress not merely as a momentary political victory but as a model for how evidence-based oversight can identify consequential inconsistencies that require correction regardless of partisan alignments. Their confrontation, culminating in Crockett's devastating presentation of contradictory Justice Department standards, demonstrated that thorough preparation, focused on specific documentary evidence, can prove more powerful than general constitutional arguments or partisan accusations. As we've seen in this remarkable exchange between former Attorney General Barr and Congresswoman Crockett, thorough research and documented evidence can transform congressional oversight from partisan theater into substantive accountability. If you found value in this analysis, please like this video and subscribe to our channel for more examinations of pivotal moments in our democratic institutions. Hit the notification bell to stay informed of our latest uploads. We welcome your thoughts in the comments. What aspects of Crockett's evidence-based approach do you find most valuable for ensuring accountability across partisan lines? See you in our next video.